All right, so I'm Kate Kooyman. I work for the Christian Reformed Church Office of Social Justice, and we've invited two of our sort of most trusted folks who are on the ground doing work in immigration and refugee issues to talk to us a little bit about what's happening right now, help us understand better so that we can hear better what our calling is to engage on this stuff. And so I'm super grateful that both of you are here. Two people whose ideas and thoughts and processing and faithfulness on this issue I really, really trust. So thanks so much for this. I want to give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourselves and help people understand how you fit in with all the work that's happening right now. So Susan, would you be willing to go first?
Sure. My name is Susan Reed. I am an immigration and immigrant rights attorney. I've been practicing law exclusively in this area, exclusively in nonprofit, including faith-based nonprofit settings for about 15 years. And about 10 years ago, we founded the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, which is a statewide legal resource center for all of Michigan's immigrant communities.
Thanks, Susan. And Matt.
Yeah, so my name is Matt Soerens. I work at an organization called World Relief. I'm the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization. So our mission at World Relief is to empower local churches to serve the most vulnerable. And my job, especially in the U.S. context, we work globally as well, but in the U.S. context, is to help us do that better and to work more closely with local churches, particularly to serve refugees and other immigrants. And I'm also the national coordinator for something called the Evangelical Immigration Table, which is a coalition that World Relief is a part of and helped us start a number of years ago. Includes a number of denominations and other evangelical groups that are looking for how do we have biblical principles to inform the way we approach both our immigrant neighbors, but also questions of immigration policy. And I'm based out of the Chicagoland area.
So I think some people who are watching this might be familiar with your books, Matt, which are really helpful, I think, for people who are just starting to try to understand, like, what are we even talking about when we talk about refugee policy or when we're talking about it? And I know that there's a second edition of Welcoming the Stranger that you co-wrote, and I just wanted to give a shout out for that. For people who feel like they might need a primer, like how does immigration work and what does it mean that we should be kind of called as Christians to engage? I always tell them to read that book, so you should read the book. All right, cool. So it feels like this month has been particularly whirlwind in terms of what is happening in the United States to immigrants. And if you're a person who cares about this stuff, it's been a little bit hard to even keep our heads above water. What is happening? And it's been feeling to me like over the last couple of years, that has become something that we've almost had to get accustomed to. Just so quickly we are moving, we're hearing rhetoric, we're seeing policy changes, we're seeing funding changes, and it all has real impact for immigrants in our communities, for our communities just at large. I imagine for the work that you guys do. So I want to maybe just do a quick overview of like, what are the big things that have been happening lately and how can we see them as all parts of one whole so that we can have a good sense of like, what's the moment that we are in? So do either of you feel like you want to pull up some highlights or some important parts of that whole that we're experiencing right
now? Sure. I'll go first
Go for it, Susan.
Of a policy perspective. So there's a number of enforcement and policy shifts and impacts that we're watching closely. Obviously, the continuing now, I guess I would call it a slow motion crisis around the termination of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. There is a discharge petition in Congress, which would force a vote. We're very supportive of a vote on a Clean Dream Act, a vote that would put the original Dream Act that benefits young people who came to the U.S. as children and have lived in the U.S. for a long time in front of Congress because we know it would pass. It's very clear that it would pass, but it hasn't been put to a vote on a bipartisan basis. And there is a question about whether or not the president would sign it he said a lot of different things about that, but this is really psychological torture for people who have had this status in most cases for 5 years. The average age of someone with DACA is 26, and a large percentage of people with DACA have their own young U.S. citizen children. So that's really one that Congress needs to take a look at. A couple of other policy issues I would lift up: the ongoing, again, kind of invisible crisis around temporary protected status, particularly for folks from Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Haiti. I'm trying to be really concise, but I want to say, don't forget these folks. These are people who in some cases have had these statuses for almost 20 years. They're set to lose them over the next 18 months. We're talking about 1 million people who have status now who will become undocumented because of these terminations, and there is no plan for them. And so, you know, when Senator Durbin tried to bring up the situation of folks with these statuses in meetings about immigration with the White House, that's when we had to have our whole conversation about whether or not the president used vulgarity to describe those countries. I'm not as offended by vulgarity as I am offended by the policy, right? That some people just don't make good Americans. And these are folks who have been here and been proving with us every day that they make amazing Americans. Mass workplace raids. Just this week, 114 greenhouse and garden center workers were arrested at Corso's Flower and Garden Center in Ohio. 200 immigration agents, by some accounts, went to Sandusky, Ohio to conduct that raid. 97 folks arrested in Bean Station, Tennessee in April. These kinds of raids had not happened for a long time and are ramping up to the point where I think ICE is organized enough now that we're going to be seeing these rapid fire. They devastate communities. Try to imagine, I mean, many of these workplaces have many members of the same family and extended family working there, members of the same congregations. They are so devastating. So that's really something that we're seeing, and people can really think about preparing their community. What would happen? Would my church throw open its doors? How would we support families, whole communities where 100 people might be missing the following day, right? And then the last thing I would actually lift up, you know, as part of a policy shift, as we get started here, is this issue called public charge. And again, I'm trying to be really concise, but I want you to remember those words: public charge. It's a silent, quiet change that's already happening abroad, but it's meant to keep people who would otherwise have a family-based immigration option out of the United States. It's an anti-quote-unquote chain migration policy. And essentially it's a way to deny visas, and all the rules and policies are being changed. There will soon be a published proposal, and people should comment on it, so watch for that public charge issue. And then I think I'll throw to Matt before I talk a little more about what's happening at the border. Does that make sense, Kate?
Yeah, please. That sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Susan said is definitely very concerning, and unfortunately I think there are more things that are concerning. It's hard to be concise right now. I would just add, I'll let you add to what I'll say, Susan, but there is a situation at the border that I think is particularly concerning and has appropriately gotten a lot of attention in the last week or two. The Attorney General Sessions announced a shift in policy, which is kind of maybe unofficially been happening for a little while, but it's now officially the policy of what they're calling a zero tolerance policy at the U.S.-Mexico border, where basically anyone apprehended without a visa coming to the border, even if they're seeking, they're looking for Border Patrol agents seeking to apply for asylum, which is the law allows, are being charged with at least the misdemeanor criminal offense of unlawful entry, which is a shift in policy, especially in cases where someone is seeking asylum or where they're accompanied by their children, because the effect of that is their kids are taken away from them. And while the parents are jailed, the kids are sent in most cases to the custody of the Department of Health and Human Services. And in some cases, if they do apply for asylum and are in that, could be for months in an immigrant detention facility, it's a really traumatic situation for children. And I think that's been particularly upsetting for a lot of Christians who believe in that, you shouldn't take a small child from a mother or father who love them and are just looking to try to get them safety, and often trying to avail themselves to what U.S. law allows with our asylum system. And then relatedly, there's also been a lot of changes to the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, and that's something we work with very directly at World Relief, so it's really important to us. But people who abroad have applied for refugee status or been referred to the U.S. by the United Nations as refugees, in a normal year, we might have, in recent years, 60, 70, 80,000 refugees come into the United States. In fact, in 2016, calendar year, it was about almost 100,000. If you go back to 1980, it was more than 200,000 refugees being brought to the U.S. in a given year. In 2018, we're on track to have less than 22,000. So it's just a really dramatic reduction in the number of refugees being allowed into the United States. And again, that's related because, for example, when a family from El Salvador who is fleeing violence and is afraid for their lives, if there was the hope of applying for refugee status, let's say in a neighboring country, which was happening in some cases, a couple of years ago, they wouldn't want to make a very dangerous trip across Mexico and hope to apply for asylum at the border. But when those legal options for those fleeing persecution are minimized so dramatically, it leaves people feeling like they have no choice but to try to get to the border, which is not safe or easy, and then to request asylum. And then when they do so, even though our law allows them to request asylum, we're taking small children from their parents. So we could go, there's a lot that's happening, but it's very troubling, I think, especially for people who care and believe that, in all but the rarest of circumstances, the government should not be taking children from their parents.
So, go ahead.
Well, one thing too that I wanted to add as maybe a point of clarification for some folks is that there's been a lot of media interest in the idea that there are lost children in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who again is part of Health and Human Services. There's so many acronyms, it's like an alphabet soup, but they do the custody of unaccompanied children and the custody of the children that the government is making unaccompanied by taking them from their parents. Late last year, the deputy director of ORR gave some testimony about children who ORR had released, and ORR's efforts to follow up with them, which were in most cases successful with respect to about 8,000 children, but in the case of a portion of that group, unsuccessful. But again, those are children that ORR had released to either their own family members, in some cases their own parents. They were no longer in ORR custody. Now, there is some evidence that ORR has released children to traffickers. That is gravely concerning. There are serious concerns about the process ORR goes through around release and around follow-up, but it's important to keep in mind that release is a good thing for children. Release is actually what we want. And the best way for follow-up to happen to ensure that children have been released in a safe situation would be for the government to provide post-release services, whether that's mental health services, certainly legal services, case management. Those services are potentially being cut right now. And so a good way to think about if you're disturbed by the idea that ORR has lost children is, one, it's always going to be hard for any government to figure out who the right person to care for a child is when no parent is available. So stop making parents unavailable through this zero tolerance policy that Matt talked about, I think is really the answer to that question.
And I'm so glad for the clarification on some of those things, because I do think that one of the really difficult things right now is trying to keep straight all the different ways that it feels like things are changing, or our already incredibly complicated immigration system and policy is shifting in ways that I think do not reflect what we as Christians, or we as Americans who believe in systems that work and that they're fair, I think it's just hard to keep it all straight. So we want to be active on the solutions that are available to us rather than being outraged about things that we simply just sort of don't fully understand. Matt, I cut you off. What were you going to say?
No, I would absolutely affirm that and what Susan said. I think, I spent my Memorial Day weekend looking at Twitter too much and following all the outrage that was happening about these lost children, and knowing how that the Office of Refugee Resettlement system works for unaccompanied minors. I was concerned immediately that, most of these kids, like, again, as Susan said, there should be more oversight. We want to make sure that they're in safe situations. But in the vast majority of those cases, those kids are with their families. Right. And that's actually the best place for them. And my concern, which I think is unfortunately proven true, is the pushback to that can be, you're right, we should not release those kids to their families. We should put them in jail. I mean, there was a Wall Street Journal headline the other day that is one of the proposals now. We need Congress to change things so that we can jail children. And I mean, you don't have to get past that headline. And I just would challenge people to stop and take a step back and ask, do we think it's a good idea to jail children? I think most of us would say, no, 4-year-olds should never be in jail. Like, that's just not a good idea. And especially, it's one thing, I mean, it's always going to be a hard circumstance when you have a genuinely unaccompanied child, a 14-year-old who shows up without their parents. Obviously, it's a horrific situation that they're facing, that would seem the best option. And often it's because the parents are already in the United States. But that's going to be one challenge for our government. It has to have a process to deal with. It's a whole nother challenge and related to a new policy at the border when our government is unaccompanying children. That is to say, they were accompanied by their mom or their dad or both. And our government is charging them criminally with a misdemeanor offense, which they can do under the law, or that may be tested in court, but it is a misdemeanor offense to unlawfully enter the country. But it's also a misdemeanor offense for me to speed, 81 miles an hour down the interstate in Chicago. The Chicago police are not required to ticket, and not only ticket, but jail everyone who commits that offense, which is the maximum penalty for that misdemeanor offense. All law enforcement uses what we call prosecutorial discretion, which is to say they use the laws to ensure public safety, and there may be instances when it's appropriate to charge someone with a particular statute, but you don't have to use that statute every single time, especially when it would clearly not be in the common good or the public interest to be taking children away from their families when their only reason they're there is not to do harm, it's to seek asylum or to seek safety in the United States.
Right.
Yeah, Kate, something you said, I know I'm the policy person in this video, but, and the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center is a secular organization, and our staff is made up of people of many faiths and no faith in some cases, but I am a Christian, and I really hear what you're saying about how confusing it is. I am, to abandon my Christian humility for a minute, like kind of an expert on these things. And I currently feel a little bit nauseated by all the different pieces that there are and all the different work to do. But at the same time, I think our command is so clear as Christians. The God who speaks to us in the Old Testament more than 30 times, and I'm sure this is in Matt's book, tells us that we're to welcome the stranger. And then Jesus comes along and says, actually, there are no strangers, right? If the only law is love, then there are no strangers. The Catholic bishops of the US and Mexico wrote a beautiful letter in the 90s, and it's called Strangers No Longer. And so I think, no one should feel like they're going to do the wrong thing if they are reaching out to the institutions that they're a part of, and they're reaching out to their members of Congress and saying, where is the love and mercy in the things that our country is doing? That's what I want to see as a Christian. And if you take that as your standard and you react in that way as your standard, you're not going to make a mistake. And if you have the love and the skill and the time and the ability to really start following what Church World Service is putting out, and again, you have social media, you have websites, really start following trusted organizations, whether it's the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center or the National Immigration Law Center, or any number of really reputable immigrant rights groups, you're going to get great direction on very concrete action you can take. So example, that public charge issue, there's going to be a real opportunity to make meaningful difference on that. If you can start educating yourself on that issue, and you can think of an institution that you're a part of that might be able to make a comment, right, on whether it's fair to tell immigrants who are trying to get immigration status that if their families or they use public benefits that they're eligible for, that their children are eligible for, they might not be able to get their immigration status. If you can think of one institution, a healthcare institution, an educational institution that you could convince should make a comment on that when the new rule is published in the Federal Register, probably later this summer, that would be a great project.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things, Susan, while you were talking, and then Matt, I think you also spoke to this, is if we're looking at the big picture, one of the things that I think has changed in the last couple of years is that we're no longer talking about what do we do about people who are sort of outside of the legal immigration framework, which is, I think, what Christians used to be really focused on in terms of immigration reform. Now, I think what we are guarding against is breaking down legal pathways that already exist, making it harder for people who do have sort of a legal access to these benefits, or who maybe do have a legal claim to asylum. People who do have a family relationship with an immigrant who could be able to petition for them. So in all of these ways, we're no longer talking about creating more pathways for people to be able to come legally to this country. Now we are just trying to guard what we already have so that it doesn't shrink. And I think for Christians, one of the ways, Matt, that you pointed out was our refugee resettlement numbers. But that is one of many, many ways. Temporary protected status, again, these are people who have been here with legal status, who are now losing that legal status. I think that's a big theme that maybe is getting missed. And then the other theme that I hear is family. So I think for a long time, it seemed like we had an immigration system that did say there is an importance for all of us when families remain together. And now we're seeing, in many ways, policies and practices and laws that are changing that value. So to me, that's one of the sort of, we have to be able to see the forest for the trees. If those are things that we value and that we think are important to remain, I think we need to be able to see all the different examples of that. And when we speak to Congress, to be able to say, I want to have legal pathways. It seems like those are going away. I also want families to stay together. I'm so alarmed by that. So that when we're talking about these kids at the border, it's not just these kids. I don't want a solution I want a solution for that really bad. Every time I look at my kids, I think about it. But also, there are families who have been suffering for so long that aren't at the border, because this is sort of a broader thing. It's a theme that's problematic. Do you guys want to say anything about that?
Well, I was just going to add, I think that dynamic of not only, as you said, for a long time, the controversial debate in immigration policy was, what do you do with people who are undocumented? And that's still controversial, and it's very difficult for people who are undocumented right now. But it's not just a question of, are we for or against illegal immigration? And to be clear, nobody's been for illegal immigration, but more for what's the process for how we get those who are unlawfully present right with the law, which the vast majority of them want to be. But recently, it's actually been, a lot of push against legal immigration as well. And I think that's something we need to be careful of, or at least, as we advocate. I absolutely want a solution for Dreamers, for example, and I want Congress to do that. We're very likely to see a proposal, and we have already in the Senate, that is something of a solution for Dreamers, but paired with dramatic cuts to legal migration, including cutting family reunification possibilities, as much as 40% cuts to the total number of immigrant visas. Which the irony of that is, if there are fewer legal options for people to come to the United States, but there are jobs, and right now there are literally more job openings in this country than there are people who are looking for jobs. Like, we have a very low unemployment rate. That's a great problem to have. But it's a time when we actually need more immigrants, just on an economic level, to say nothing of on a moral level, but just on a national economic level, our country needs more people filling those jobs. But we're systematically, or at least there's efforts to systematically reduce the number of options to migrate lawfully to the country. So I think it's really important, as you said, that we keep standing up for families, that we watch as legislation happens, that we fix problems like this DACA situation, which the administration kind of created that issue by ending the DACA program, but also that we don't, and we don't end up with a compromise that is actually a net step back as well.
Yeah, Kate, your question, and Matt, your response, for me, boil down to this. We are seeing something very important revealed in these attacks on legal pathways to immigrate to the U.S. or pathways for people in the U.S. With family connections to get status. And it's this. It's that our immigration system in some ways is broken, but in many ways is working exactly as it was designed to work. It was designed to perpetuate white dominance. The very first immigration law is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And from the Chinese Exclusion Act on forward, almost every time there's any kind of, when we get into that restrictive mode, right, it's really a social concern about promoting white dominance, and in some cases, white Protestant dominance in the country. And I could spend a lot of time really charting that out for folks, but I just want you to think of this moment as revealing that, because folks may have sincerely believed that the race that was run in 2016 was somehow just about the rule of law. You may have sincerely believed that. I think there were a lot of indicators that wasn't the case, but I think you could have sincerely believed that. People have been telling me for 15 years as I've spoken publicly, oh, no, you've got me wrong. My only concern is the rule of law. Well, these folks are trying to take away the legal pathways because there is a deep feeling that people just don't make good Americans when they come from poverty, when they're not white, when they're not Christian. We really have a call as Christians whose only law is love to reject that with respect to our brothers and sisters.
I really appreciate what you said when you talked about there are no more strangers. I think that is what we are called to live, right? That we see in the face of all human beings the image of God and the presence of Jesus Christ, right? So I think it's really important that we not only believe that, but that belief turns into some sort of action. And I feel an urgency at this moment to talk clearly about what's happening, and also to be able to do something. So in the sort of 2 minutes that we have left, what do you hope people understand, not just hopelessness about how hard this is, but what sort of hope can you offer in terms of what our calling is to do and be? And they're going to cut us off in a couple minutes. So be
You go first, Susan.
Well, so I know that the congressional offices, I know just saying call members of Congress feels futile. It is not futile. And it doesn't really matter what you say if you look at the policies you're hearing about and let your member of Congress know, as someone speaking from a place of love, that you're not seeing your values reflected in the policy. Literally, they're going to make a tick mark, right, on the yes, no, bad, good sheet that they're going to hand to their boss. And I can tell you from people who work in congressional offices that the way people call in no way reflects public polling or public opinion on these issues. The folks who are coming from a place of hatred and fear and loathing and disgust and not from a place of love, they call. So you lovers better call.
It's so true. My congressman just had a town hall meeting, and he said, my colleagues tell me if they get 10 calls on an issue, they start freaking out about it. And I thought, let's get them freaked out. Let's call. Make 10 calls. So Matt, you got 1 minute. What do you got?
Yeah, I would absolutely affirm that. I mean, I think it's very common among Americans to underestimate their influence in our public policy process. And so making phone calls is important. Sending letters still works. especially for those who are leaders, like church leaders, pastors. Your voice is even more influential in some ways. So writing a letter to the editor of the newspaper or an op-ed in the newspaper. Right now, the Evangelical Immigration Table has a letter particularly regarding this family separation issue at the border that a bunch of national denominational leaders have signed, but I encourage local pastors to sign on to that as well. And then I would also add a lot of immigrants right now, including in our congregations, are feeling really afraid and really unsure of their place in this country. So it's a great time to just reach out to your friends who are immigrants and let them know that you love them, that you value them, that you're glad they're your neighbors in a literal sense. And I don't just say this as sort of like a nice Christian cherry on top of a conversation, but I really believe we need to be faithful in prayer, and not as a substitute for those other things, but as a fuel for those other things. We need to be, Jesus tells people the story of this persistent widow who pleads with this unjust judge for justice. And eventually she gets it because she's persistent. And Jesus says that's how you should be in your prayers. Be persistent, be faithful, keep at it. And I think that we can't give up on praying that God would bring about justice, even in systems that seem incredibly dysfunctional right now and set against the people who are most vulnerable.
Yeah. Well, I am glad for your persistence, both of you. It is a light for me. It's such an inspiration, and I pray for you guys. And I am really grateful for this opportunity to hear you smart people talk about this stuff. I am hopeful, especially because I believe that we have an opportunity to show love, and it especially looks like love in a context that is feeling like the opposite of that. And so I hope that this video is something that's been helpful for folks, and share it if you think there's people who could better understand. And we'll try to make it clear in the comments how to exactly do the things that were suggested here. But thank you guys both so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate.
Thanks,
okay.
Matt.